Some things you just don't learn in Catholic school. In second year history class, someone asked when we were going to study the Middle Ages, being into fantasy and whatnot, to which the teacher answered that it will be later in a different subject, because it will take too long. We went straight from classical antiquity to our national history. Later meant actually never. No Christian Roman Empire, no persecution of pagans, no crusades, no Knights Templar, no church corruption, no Inquisition, and no other point of view of what we did study in a different subject, from the conquest of the Americas on, than praising for Columbus, who brought light into a new world full of barbarians. All this we had to file under realities we had to learn for ourselves. What we had a lot of instead were Bible studies about Jesus' teachings. He came to bring truth, sacrificed himself for our sins, and the world was a bad place until the truth spread. Is that so? I couldn't help but think that between the crucifixion of Christ in the 1st century AD and modern church, whose founding he actually never saw to fruition, a lot of water had run under the bridge. Some things I learned the church did in that time frame weren't necessarily aligned with his teachings, I suppose. So the natural question arose, what would Jesus think of the church? To find the answers I seek, first we should agree on the basis of the character of Jesus, not in a historical vein, but as we are to take him according to the Gospels. For this, I shall ask for the help of esteemed English philosopher and atheist Bertrand Russell. Professor Russell does not agree with the superlative wisdom or goodness of Christ. On the matter of his wisdom, there is a vindictive fury against those people who will not listen to his preaching. It is worthier of a sage to take the line of Socrates, who was quite bland towards deaf ears, than that of Christ's indignation. Ye serpents, ye generation of vipers, how can ye escape the damnation of hell? On the matter of his supreme goodness and morals, he finds them hard to attribute them to a man who believes in everlasting punishment, quoting Christ himself when he says in Matthew 13:41-42, "The Son of Man shall send forth his angels, and they shall gather out of his kingdom all things that offend, and them which do iniquity, and shall cast them into a furnace of fire. There shall be wailing and gnashing of teeth." A doctrine of eternal fire is a doctrine of cruelty, not of goodness. However, as there are two sides to God's character throughout both the Old and the New Testaments, there are two sides to his Son as well, for Christ was the man who said, according to Matthew 6:34, "Therefore do not worry about tomorrow, for tomorrow will worry about itself. Each day has enough trouble of its own." A very wise maxim indeed. He also said, according to Matthew 5:39, "Resist not evil, but whosoever shall smite thee on thy right cheek, turn to him the other also," which shows a certain degree of moral goodness if you are willing to listen. Christ is at best a complicated character, and so is the history of his church. In order to answer the main question then, I'm going to put up this concise evaluation of his character against the realities we had to learn for ourselves. I'll make use of a point system. If the church follows the teaching of Christ, that's 1 point for it. Otherwise, if the church deviates, point goes to Christ. If the church wins, it shall ensure its place as the Lord's teaching's pride. If Christ wins, its place shall be of shame. Now we did learn about the persecution of early Christians, the renowned martyrdoms that came out of it, which our Christ, being an apocalyptic prophet who sought to enlighten the obscurity of the world before the end, at the cost of even his life, would strongly agree with, granting the first point to the Church. But its history here only begins. Constantine I, sole Roman emperor during the 4th century AD, legalized Christian assemblies through his Edict of Milan. Collegia was a term that referred to trade unions under the patronage of a Roman god that needed state permission to operate legally. Christian collegia, under no Roman god whatsoever, weren't legal, thus liable to persecution under charges of atheism, until Constantine made them so. To this followed tax exemptions and the building of churches. Other religious reformations followed too. After his assassination in 44 BC, Julius Caesar ascended to the pantheon of Roman gods, the first but not last Roman ruler to do so. The imperial cult, the divineness of the emperor himself, became precepts of the Roman pagan religion for the next centuries. Then Constantine ignored all of that in favor of Christian beliefs. With the new imperial cult, Christian Roman emperors will stand in for Christ until he returned to usher in the kingdom of God. Upon death, they'd be considered saints. This made the emperor both head of state and head of church. Will that not be idolatry though? 1 John 5:21, written by Christ's own cousin, closes the chapter with a final warning. Little children, keep yourselves from idols, that is, worshipping anyone other than God and His Son. Well, sainthood is reserved for people of higher piety, meant to intercede for us, rest of mere mortals, in heaven. One doesn't worship saints, but rather ask them to intercede in one's favor in the worshipping of God. Then, no, idolatry is what this workaround is replacing, so Jesus will have to agree with them. Any deviant who steered away from the theology of the emperor will be considered a heretic against orthodoxy, the right belief. Heresy meant treason, and treason meant death, although more as a threat than an actual course of action. For Christ, it will be enough for heretics to burn in the lake of fire, which is the second death. Through his Edict of the Provincials, Constantine stated, "Let no one disturb another, let each man hold fast to that which his soul wishes." Theory he didn't quite follow in practice. 2 points for the church in one sweeping motion. Subsequent emperors held as fast as they could to the tenet of compassion, whilst stripping paganism of its power, from the commoners to the higher echelons of society. Constantius II, Valens, Valentinian I, and Theodosius continued Constantine's policy of dismantling institutionalized paganism. They ended tax reliefs and subsidies for pagans and outlawed sacrifices. Violence was not limited to the rhetoric of conquest present in legal documents. Pagans were kicked out of their temples to see them repurposed for Christianity, and pagan monuments were taken down, such as the Altar of Victory, which had been in place since the times of Augustus. Not the least of this at all is the behavior of the emperors themselves. Engaging in power struggles that called for poisoning, civil and foreign conflicts, executions, and use of slave labor are to be set upon the balance as well. So, one of the points goes to Christ. Until the rise of Constantine as head of state and church, there was no central authority in Christianity. From the British Isles to Constantinople, many diverse groups existed. Christians adopted what they knew had always worked. Greek ecclesia as their system of political assemblies, and the figure of the Roman provincial overseer, a bishop for every diocese. Bishops were in charge of administrative tasks, thus holding considerable political power, and could also absolve followers from sins by the Holy Spirit. In time, they paralleled the whole Roman administrative apparatus. What could Christ's opinion on the matter be? Here are two passages. One is John 6:15. When Jesus knew that they were about to come and take him by force to make him king, he withdrew again to the mountain by himself. He turned around and walked away when the people of Judea took him for a rebel to be followed into political change. The other passage is John 18:36. My kingdom is not of this world. If my kingdom were of this world, my servants would have been fighting. Nothing to add, just Christ's attitude towards the following centuries of church development. One of monolithic, ostentatious buildings and power and fortune beyond imagination. One massive point for Christ. There once was a man called Johann Tetzel, a Dominican monk who traveled around the Teutonic region with a little rhyme. As soon as the coin in the coffer rings, the soul from purgatory springs. Johann was an indulgence seller, dirty deeds forgiven dirt cheap. The 11th and 12th centuries saw the rise in the belief in purgatory, a place between heaven and hell wherein souls suffer punishment for sins committed in life to cleanse themselves before ascending. Believers wanted to avoid it at any cost, so the church took this wish to heart, sending people like Johann to put fear into their minds and pull money out of their pockets. The indulgence was seen as proof of God's willingness to forgive, given someone of higher piety interceded for the sinner. At the beginning it was limited to an act of penitence, but given someone's illness or old age or inability to perform penitence, a fine could be paid in its place to be used for charity. This gave rise to people like Johann Tetzel. Forgiveness was drawn upon from the treasury of merit, a sort of goodwill bank. Goodwill had accumulated through the works of Jesus, Mary, and all the saints and martyrs, so people could draw upon it for their own salvation. Instead of doing penitence, people opted for paying. The system was complex. The clergy could calculate exactly how much every sin cost, either in purgatory time or money. The bigger the sentence, the more you had to cough up. Every purchase came with a receipt, and you could get a receipt for someone who had already passed, or even for sins to be committed in the future, for parts of sins, or for all your sins in order to skip purgatory entirely. Unscrupulous indulgence sellers, feudal lords who allowed sales to be carried on in their land for a margin of the profits, and the church itself made a ton of cash from such scheme. When it comes to money, Christ said it clearly in Matthew 6:24. No one can serve two masters. You cannot serve both God and money. Even though Pope Pius V abolished indulgences in 1567, how many since then have bought their way into bolstering their faith-based connections? Another massive point for Christ again. If you were a cleric of any importance in Clermont-Ferrand, France, during the 11th century, on the 27th of November of 1095, you would have been standing before Pope Urban II when he promised total indulgence of all their sins to any European who partook in the crusade against the, quote, a cursed race utterly alienated from God. End of quote. The Seljuks, a Turkish tribe of the steppe, had won major victories against Eastern Roman armies in Asia Minor that culminated in the taking of Jerusalem in 1087. A crusade against the so-called infidels would 1. Bring the Holy Land back under Christian jurisdiction. 2. Protect the burial site of Jesus of Nazareth. 3. Grant Emperor Alexios I, with the help of the Western forces, a chance to regain Asia Minor. And 4. In case of a victory, Urban II could gain an advantage against the Holy Roman Emperor in the west and the Patriarch of Constantinople in the east. The recruitment process was an unprecedented success. So knights from all across Europe, clad in mail and steel armor, wielding maces, hammers and cross-shaped swords, march on towards the liberation of the Holy Land. Upon learning this, I wonder how a religion founded upon a preacher who commanded to turn the other cheek to whosoever shall smite thee, taking the exemplary course of action of being nailed to a cross without resisting, could call for war. Saint Augustine of Hippo had the answers I was looking for. On one hand, war is the worst state of human action. Once engaged in, it should be escaped as fast as possible, the most effective manner to do so being going all out on it to bring it to an end. On the other hand, if war is the worst state of human action, it should not be waged at all. The concept of just war is the perfect middle ground. It is possible to declare and wage war in a just manner. Saint Augustine declares that to be just, war should be a form of punishment or self-defense, either to fight sinners for their own benefit or to return the world to a state of peace. The right time to not turn the other cheek then, quote, is when it seems likely to benefit the one for whose sake it is done, in order to bring about correction and a return to agreement. He continues, he whose freedom to do wrong is taken away suffers a useful form of restraint, since nothing is more unfortunate than the good fortune of sinners who grow bold by not being punished. End of quote. But when it does not seem likely to benefit the subject, then we must work to correct the subject and, quote, act with a sort of kindly harshness when we are trying to make unwilling souls yield. End of quote. This kindly harshness entails the duty that defines just war not only as an option, but as an obligation. Surely this will be a point for Christ, whose doctrine is being malleabilized to benefit political interests. Unbeknownst to me and my uncountable hours of catechism, this is a point for the Church. For Christ states in Matthew 10:34-39, do not think that I have come to bring peace to earth. I have not come to bring peace, but a sword. For I have come to set a man against his father, and a daughter against her mother. And whoever does not take his cross and follow me is not worthy of me. Whoever finds his life will lose it, and whoever loses his life for my sake will find it. The Crusades opened a pathway from the west to the Holy Land. Pilgrims walked and rode for months to come visit the burial site of Christ from all across Europe. It was the perfect opportunity for robbers and bandits to make a fortune. Pilgrims carried enough money to pay for food and shelter throughout the journey and were generally unarmed and, if armed, barely trained. The Knights Templar were nobles, thus martially trained, whose call to fight for God took them on the path to a monastic life. But aside of praying for salvation, they fought. When not in war with the infidels, they lent their services towards protecting the pilgrims. Being now a much necessary organization, they received tax exemptions and donations of land and money from kings, queens, and popes. Soon, the pilgrims took to them not only for their physical well-being, but for their monetary safety too. Pilgrims could deposit their money for the journey in one temple monastery, get a letter of change, and take the money out upon reaching Jerusalem. The knights realized banking was good business, so they added money lending to the list of services. Being that lending money in exchange for interest was forbidden by the church and only a thing Jews did, they sidestepped this by retaining the production of mortgage property. And we all know what Christ thought of bankers and money traders. And he overturned the tables of the money changers and the seats of those who sold doves. He said to them, "My house shall be called a house of prayer, but you're making it a den of robbers." Point for Christ. Now, when it comes to money and power fever, few eras are worse for the church than the Italian Renaissance. Medici, Malatesta, Sforza, Colonna, and Borgia are all names that resound when it comes to exemplary corruption. None of their deeds are worse than the others. Constantly vying for the papal throne, foul tactics abounded. The sin of simony was business as usual. Alfonso Borgia bribed his way to papacy, becoming Pope Calixtus III. His nephew, Alexander VI, elevated 10 of his relatives to the College of Cardinals, endowed others with fiefdoms, and bore a host of children with his mistress. Martin V secured vast estates for the Colonna family in Naples. Sixtus IV granted 6 of his relatives the title of cardinal. Clement VII made his illegitimate son Alessandro the first Duke of Florence, and Paul III did as much with his as the Duke of Parma. And the usual plotting, poisoning, stabbing, and executing. Need I find a Bible passage against all of this? Point for Christ. While the clergymen of Italy were having the time of their lives, the Catholic monarchs of Spain took things much more seriously. Fernando and Isabel had married. The kingdoms of Aragon and Castilla became one, and the false converts presented a danger to Christian Spain. A papal bull by our buddy Sixtus IV authorized them to name inquisitors to take care of the problem. They would have done it with or without his authorization. The inquisitors proved so severe that Sixtus tried to intervene, but to no avail. The Catholic monarchs had too powerful a tool in the Inquisition. Though this was not a recent or unique practice. During the 1140s, the Catholic Church took notice of a sect going by the name of Cathars. They believed in the sinful nature of the material. The spiritual world of goodness had been created by God, while the material world of sin had been created by the devil. And so they were inquisited. It happened with the Hussites in the 15th century, and would happen with the Protestants in the 16th century, and many more. At different doctrines, massacre ensued. I'm at a loss. On the matter of if Christ would agree, do we turn the other cheek, or do we bring the sword? It might be the first gray point on this list. Perhaps I am forced to declare a draw on this one. Issues of church behavior did not stay in Europe. Listen to this shit. Upon the Spaniards arriving to the continent of America, they brought a document with them to be read out loud and interpreted to indigenous people. It was called the Requerimiento, requirement, and it was based on the bulls of good old Pope Alexander VI, who donated the Americas to the Catholic monarchs in exchange for their evangelization. The requerimiento stated that in the name of both the Spanish crown and the Pope, the conquistadors had the right to conquer the land. Just imagine being a native in those circumstances. Some dudes wearing shiny plates, who might as well come from a different planet, read to you that some other dude, who does not own your continent, has pulled authority out of his ass to give it to them so they can force you to worship a 1500 years old carpenter or burn. Oh, and if you decline, that's reason enough to declare just war and correct your heresy by the sword. The conquest of the Americas is a complex issue. At the same time, theology was invoked to commit brutal excesses by today's and then moral standards. It was also invoked to protect the rights of the indigenous people. Dominican missionaries like Antonio de Montesinos, Pedro de Córdoba, and Bartolomé de las Casas, who risked their lives every day evangelizing, and shockingly backed by the Spanish Inquisition, denounced the excesses of the conquistadors, which led to Pope Paul III's issuing of a bull condemning those who engaged in slavery and mistreatment of natives as devils. King Charles I issued the new laws in New Spain in 1542, and a decade and a half later, the requerimiento was abolished. Another draw. No essay on what would Jesus think of the church will be complete without the most appalling of its actions. How can I put it? Well, bothering of children. The corruption, deviancy, and brutality of the Catholic Church were not limited to politics. Its tentacles reached too into carnal affairs. USA 2002. Enter Cardinal Bernard Law, Archbishop of Boston Diocese. Among others, he protected priests such as John Geoghegan, who was accused of 130 charges of such behavior over 30 years of service. Cardinal Law kept him on as a priest. Law resigned as Archbishop only after the Boston Globe had uncovered the entire affair in a series of hundreds of articles. What did the church do? Pope John Paul II, so beloved, personally appointed Law in 2004 as Supreme Vicar of the Church of Santa Maria Maggiore in Rome. And in 2005 he was part of the conclave that chose Joseph Ratzinger. In 1947, Father Gerald Fitzgerald moved to New Mexico and founded the Servants of the Paraclete, an order of Catholic priests devoted to healing deviants through praying alone. After refusing to accept any more deviants, realizing there was no cure for their debauchery, he warned American bishops and even the Pope. No one listened. Pope Paul II had a fatal heart attack on July 26, 1471, while some say being worked on by a page, a boy in charge of running errands and delivering messages. And I could keep going, but my time is much too limited and my stomach much too weak for that. Jesus said in Matthew 19:14, "Let the children come to me and do not hinder them, for the kingdom of heaven belongs to such as this." To which these priests took a literal approach. A big fat point for Christ. The end scoreboard is Christ, 6 points, Church, 3 points. On March 12, 2000, on occasion of the jubilee of a new millennium for the Church, Pope John Paul II begged in the name of his organization forgiveness for the following: the Crusades, for which I had actually established a point for the Church, is now conceded to Christ. The Inquisition, which was a draw, goes to Christ. The persecution of Jewish people and so-called false converts, that falls under this category as well. The forced conversion of indigenous people during the conquest of the Americas, another draw fully conceded to Christ. In years past, he had already begged forgiveness for the supporting and aiding of fascism across Europe leading up to and during World War II. Pope Paul VI had too begged for forgiveness in 1965 for the anathema of all unorthodox Christians as unbelievers and heretics, and for the blatant anti-Semitism in the form of blame for the death of Jesus. Even accounting for the enormous work of charity done by the Church, counterweighing the wickedness of its bad deeds, if you will, the scale still tips in favor of Christ. For it, we now know, apologized for things he, in part or wholly, would have agreed on, and didn't apologize for things he wouldn't have agreed on. The only way, then, for the scale to tip to the other side will be to award 1 point for every religious war in Europe from the Reconquista to the 16th, 17th and 18th centuries. And they wouldn't want me to do that, would they not, given all the forgiveness they have begged for up until this point? If Christ came back and was shown the history of his church, it would be an utter shame. And there's a reason for that. Early followers of Christ believed his second coming to be imminent. There are some standing here which shall not taste death till they see the Son of Man coming in his kingdom. Matthew 16:28. In turn, after the crucifixion and resurrection, they waited and waited and waited some more. And when it didn't happen, they realized they had to organize, attaching themselves to an existing political structure to survive, and evangelize or perish until it did. We've just seen how deviant the result actually turned out.